Ready to start? Ready? Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes? Perfect. Good morning, and let's start with this panel. My name is Nicolas Albertoni. I'm the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Uruguay. I'm really delighted and happy to moderate this very timely panel to talk about the present and the future of trade. Being the youngest member of a government and, with a very close history to this organization as it is Uruguay, I would like to start saying thank you to the WTO here in the presence of the Director-General to give us young voices, a voice to talk about the future of trade. For that, we will talk today with 5 young leaders about how we can re-globalize trade for an inclusive tomorrow and how we will do that with a youth perspective. I will introduce the team now, but before that, I would like to say that this youth-centered panel will consider which concrete measures can be taken to help shape a more sustainable, inclusive global economy that better serves future generations. As the world confronts a growing range of economic, social, and environmental challenges, today these 5 young leaders will explore how to address the rise of protectionism and how to fix and strengthen globalization. Here we have Seymour Berthoud, Head of Communication and Member of Engagement of Climate Alliance of Switzerland, Bonnie Chu, Managing Director of Social Investments Consultancy, Stephanie Eiram, Director of the Center of Green Growth, Gerardo Mateo, Director of Government Platform GLASS, and Lily Becerril, Teaching Fellow at Harvard University. Before we start, it is very interesting to note that we are all post-Bretton Woods and post-GATT generation. And we all have heard a lot about the relevance of multilateralism. Yet at the same time, we have heard about the challenges we have in the system. So this panel is not only relevant, I would say, but also necessary to not only focus our conversation in the past and the present, but also in the future, especially taking into account the celebration of the Summit of the Future at the UN in New York a few days from today. Just a quick point, the relevance today is that we are all voices that, as we normally said, at least in Latin America, we do not carry any backpacks from the past. So we are very, free to talk about the future. So let's begin, guys, with an introductory question that I have to you about the current situation we are nowadays in the system. As I just mentioned, we normally heard about this double narrative when we talk about the multilateral trading system. Some people talking about the relevance of the system and they are all working to continue improving it. But at the same time, we normally heard about the lack of consensus we have and say that the system is stagnated. Beyond this debate that normally sometimes is too political, we would all agree that there are important challenges today to be resolved in a system that needs to be adapted to a new world. But where to start? Where is the beginning? I would like to start now with Lily, the professor here in the panel. So what do you think, Lily, of where we have to start? We have a hyperinflation of new issues, new agenda, and still unresolved topics of the past. We see agriculture and many important debates are still unresolved, but we now have a new agenda. What do you think are the relevant topics to start?
Thank you so much for your question. A disclaimer, I'm not a professor yet, unless I have a promotion I didn't hear about. I think what you mentioned about the challenges of multilateralism is absolutely crucial. And what, in my opinion, is the biggest challenge is definitely the crisis of legitimacy that all multilateral institutions go through. Of course, at the WTO, we can think about issues regarding the appellate body. As a European, I have seen how Euroscepticism has increased in our nations. And looking at all multilateral institutions, they're faced in one way or the other with this question of the issue of legitimacy. And when we observe all these challenges, there are three main issues that arise as a pattern, as driving this crisis of legitimacy. The first one is the misalignment in incentives of national countries and national politicians with the one of multilateral institutions. We have seen this, especially in Europe, with increasing Euroscepticism, how it is easy sometimes to use multilateral institutions as scapegoats. To blame them for issues that are broader or even national. It is, however, crucial to note that countries are not the only responsible ones, and it is needed to admit that multilateral institutions sometimes have failed to reach out to the entire population of their member countries. And we are here today, as you mentioned, panelists with maybe lighter backpacks. And it is really, I think, an amazing step forward that the WTO is taking. I want to call upon all multilateral institutions as well to make sure that they include as much as possible the underprivileged, and that those fringes of the populations of member countries know what those multilateral institutions are doing for them. And those two factors make the third issue absolutely impossible to resolve, the one that I call the original issue, which is the fact that multilateral institutions were created around values. The missions were crafted around values. And what we see today is the question we're facing today is whether those institutions have legitimacy to only answer their strictly defined mission, or because those missions articulate around values, they have broader expertise, scope, and legitimacy to act on these values. And this is why we're facing a crisis of legitimacy. But I think there is still hope. There's still hope because those three drivers can be solved, and solved with the help of multilateral institutions. If we look at the first issue of misalignment in incentives, it happens that if you look at the broader scope, politicians and national governments all in all have a broader interest in cooperating. Why is that so? Because if each country kind of blames multilateral institutions, then it is each country blaming other countries for the issues. Right. And this produces kind of what one could call negative externalities. So they have overall an incentive to coordinate. And it happens that we have the perfect forum to ensure that this coordination takes place. And this is those very multilateral institutions. On the second issue, once you have a smoother cooperation of governments and multilateral institutions to promote the work that multilateral institutions are doing, then it becomes easier for those institutions to reach out to the most underprivileged one, because governments have a very granular knowledge of the issues that the underprivileged populations care about, and they're able to reach out to them directly. And once we have all citizens of member countries who are fully aware of and fully understand what those multilateral institutions are doing, then it becomes possible to solve the original issue. Because then you can ask enlightened citizens, well-informed citizens, to solve the debate democratically about whether the mandate of those institutions is only focused on the mission, or whether it is also about values. So thank you so much for this question.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you so much. Gerardo?
Hello, everyone. I want to give some context here. My background is in tech. So I'm the director of government platforms at Glass. We are a startup that is revolutionizing how governments buy. So we are trying to make public procurement easier, faster, but also compliant. So I'm very excited to be here, and I think the question here about the legitimacy of these multilateral institutions, I think it's very important to see at the data. I think data is very powerful. My background in engineering and computer science has shown us that. I have been working with governments in the United States, but also with governments in Latin America, and transparency and data-driven decisions has shown to provide more insights and understanding for everyone that is not in the day-to-day of these institutions. So I think there's a big opportunity to use technology, but also use the resources at hand and the people to provide more transparency in their organizations. And I think also that applies to many subsectors. For example, transparency in sustainability, transparency in how public funding is being used. So I would say looking at the data and publishing that data and then taking decisions on that data, it's very important. It's not only about talking, it's about doing. So I would say that is my opinion on this topic.
Thank you, Gerardo. Thank you. Stephanie.
First and foremost, thank you very much for having me here and for putting together this diverse panel that is going to talk about this really important issue. I'll get straight to it. Let me bear it down to the bare minimum. We need to contextualize things. First and foremost, trade needs to work for everybody. I'm from an environmental background and I come from the global south, so I'll talk about inclusivity, which is one of the most important things throughout all the forum. You could see it, you could tell that it went through all the discussions. Now, there are some challenges with inclusivity and legitimacy from member states of the global south being active part of everything that we do on the levels that we do them here. Now, when it comes to environmental related matters and the challenges that we face on this level, we know a few things are there. There are different policy initiatives that people have different interests generally. All the parties that are involved in all these things they have different interests, they have different priorities, they have different levels of capacity. Environmental related problems are complex in their nature, in that the various problems we have are resolved. One group has created the problem, another group has to resolve the problem. Those in the global south are facing issues with adaptation because those in the global north have developed through it. And before even we entered here, I had a discussion with somebody, and the discussion was just about why we are facing the consequences of the various environmental issues and still have to deal with trying to seek solutions on the trade levels, trying to seek solutions on environmental related matters, trying to seek solutions in different aspects. Let me get back to the fundamentals again. When initiatives, when decisions around trade are not taken with inclusivity in mind, when the different parties are struggling with different issues and have different relations with these matters, it becomes a little difficult for those in the global south to participate actively. For instance, ESG-related matters, environmental, governance, social matters. We've posed a new challenge. Today, there are a number of ESG frameworks that have been developed by Europe. There's the SFDR, there's the EU taxonomy, there's the, you name them, different sort of ESG frameworks that have been developed, and we in the global south have to deal with the effects of these because we send produce to parts of Europe, and we have to deal with these standards. Now, these standards are taking out a number of organizations who would have ordinarily entered the market with the current standards they have, and they have to adapt to it. What then is WTO's role in this particular matter? And I'll be very straight to the point with some of these issues. I would not tell too much stories. I'll just go straight to what needs to be done. And we'll come back to that even in a little bit. However, you can see that existing WTO relations and the GATT have tariff restrictions. It means that organizations should not, or different countries should consider removing certain tariffs. But the introduction of this EU taxonomies, this SFDR, these particular principles, literally cuts out a certain group out. So if the WTO is going to be able to help with development inclusivity and all that, to be able to allow the global south to partake and be very active members of trade, some of these principles that we are developing for sustainability especially conflict with WTO principles. And those are some of the things. So integration is one of the very important things we need to consider in our discussions in inclusivity and some of the problems we currently face with the old regime. Yes, climate change, sustainability, pollution are new, relatively new topics, and their gains are new. We need to, first of all, consider that trade needs to work for everybody. And there are existing problems with it, especially with inclusivity and the global south. We also need to consider that there are so many frameworks that are coming up from different parts. The EU alone, I can count like 10 on ESG principles. Asia is doing their own, the US is doing their own. There's a huge opportunity for the WTO to correlate that, build a standard that we can all work with, and consider, because when Europe does their own, so all the different taxonomies, all the different regulatory frameworks that they develop, they consider their situation before developing them. But when a neutral, and I'm not saying the EU is not neutral, but the WTO stands in a very central position to allow trades in ESG-related matters, environmental and sustainability-related matters, to inculcate the needs of the global south, to inculcate inclusivity from the global south, and also inculcate the needs of the global north, so that it's not one person applying something and we are all chasing to try and meet that. Because at our level, in the global south, we need to now adapt all the various frameworks. And when the decisions are made, they forget that it actually applies to us. Because when it comes down to it, yes, there's always the issue where, and I come from Africa, so there's always the issue where we come and plunge the raw materials and take away. And we ship, I'll use the word ship, we ship the carbon-related matters. And I know some of these principles are very common, but carbon emissions, we ship them to the global south, and environmental issues to the global south. We take the resources out of the soil. We face the direct environmental issue there. So the question then is, how do we build and integrate a non-conflicting platform, especially with the WTO central position, to affect the global south inclusiveness and to affect the global north and standardize everything? And when we come back to the second part of this discussion, I'll talk a bit about interoperability of all these frameworks, too many of them, that need to come together in multilateral agreements to allow us to operate properly in sustainability.
Thank you, Stephanie. And you're right. We will come back to more details, aspect about this idea of inclusivity that you just talked. Bonnie, what about the challenges? What do you think?
Well, challenges. So, so hi everyone. Yeah, thank you again for inviting me, and great to meet fellow young leaders on this panel. I will start with just a bit of, again, contextualizing the perspectives that I'm bringing. I think I'm probably one of the beneficiaries of free trade and world trade. I grew up in Hong Kong, and I think some rankings still show that Hong Kong is one of the freest economically places in the world. And I was also part of Model WTO because I drank the Kool-Aid of the benefits of free trade. And I was fortunate to do an internship as a delegate from the Hong Kong kind of commission in the regional think tank, Pacific Economic Cooperation Council. So that was 10 years ago. So I think I grew up believing in the benefits of free trade, and recent events have made me perhaps question if indeed free trade and world trade has indeed brought benefits. And so I've grown up to have a more nuanced view, and I think I now understand that actually those with power need to work a lot more to spread the benefits of free trade to broader segments of society. Some of the kind of particular perspectives I can share around gender equality, for example. I've done a lot of work in the past decade on this topic. Women-owned businesses, for example, tend to export less than male-owned businesses, and we know businesses, when they export, that's a huge benefit for them to grow their businesses. And there are just a lot of systemic barriers to why women-owned businesses are not exporting as much. Similarly, I think we'll talk a bit more about digital divide, but those that are not digitally included, they're not able to participate in world trade, given that so much of world trade is done digitally these days. So I think there are specific perspectives, and even growing up in Hong Kong, while Hong Kong has grown to be economically very prosperous, my grandmother was working in a factory, like garment. She was a garment worker for 20 years. And now I'm a, very educated entrepreneur, providing job opportunities to others. So there are economic miracles that can be achieved. However, Hong Kong indeed is one of the most unequal societies as well, the haves and have-nots, the rich and the poor. So I think governments need to do a lot more to address inequality issue in their respective geographies, but also what's the role of an organization like WTO, as Stephanie was mentioning, to really center inclusion in its mission. And I'll just end with my final reflection on a challenge that I think the organizations like WTO need to grapple with. Again, growing up, I had this kind of almost belief or indoctrination that economic growth is, is everything that we should pursue. And as I graduated from business school and kind of got a bit disillusioned with the world that perhaps our ancestors have left us with, I started really embracing issues around ESG, social impact particularly. And I think we really need to make sure that the multilateral organizations, businesses, all governments have a different set of KPIs, that we're not just thinking about economic growth only, but that we're thinking about well-being and planetary well-being and societal well-being. Yes, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you. Thank you so much. What about you, Simon, and about this idea of the challenges we are all facing? Where to start?
I mean, I think where to start is how to make trade works for people and planet, and not the other way around. And I will get to that, I think, in the last question. But I want to start by saying that, unlike many of you in this room, I am not a trade expert. I used to be a consultant at the Boston Consulting Group here in Geneva, quite well paid. I helped companies, develop their operations, optimize their companies. But I quickly realized that what the recommendations we were giving and the work we were doing was not compatible with planetary boundaries. So after 3 years in the job, I decided to quit. Now I am a, let's say, full-time activist here in Switzerland. And like millions of other people around the world, I obviously follow very closely what you people in this room are taking for decisions. So I come here with an external perspective, and obviously a very critical eye, particularly in view of the accelerating climate change and growing inequalities, especially within countries. And I think, as you said rightfully, we are young. We don't carry a backpack from the past. But we carry the burden of climate change that has been, given to us by the previous generation. So I want to challenge you, people in this room, during this panel. The rules of the game that you created brought us in that situation. The rules of the game that you created are threatening the habitability of this planet. Let's be clear. We, the young generation, are critical of the globalization that you created. So I hope that today we'll have time to express our views, but more importantly, that we'll give you the courage to take a critical look at the rules and beliefs on which you have built trade as we know it. And above all, that you will have the strength to change them. In short, that you take your responsibility in this world in crisis.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Simon, for this profound and very important idea of giving us, what do you think about what are the things where to start with. Now, let's put focus on your expertise, because we have a very diverse panel, not only geographically, but also in terms of our activities and social leadership. So I will go back to Lily. and about the current configuration we have nowadays in the trading system. And we know that, this profound change we have and what supply chains are reorganizing trade may change, in the future, but also in the present, the way we conceive the system we are talking about. So do you think, Lily, that supply chain dynamics is helping new actors to be involved in the system, or sometimes it works in the opposite way?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question in particular because it's very related to current event or events we've experienced recently. I think the first question would be around whether supply chains, are actually fully restructuring. We have seen, in a recent WTO report, that the speed of trade between kind of the two blocks that we can identify has indeed decreased. But this report did not find any evidence of regionalization. So the extent to which supply chains are fully experiences large-scale transformation, is still on the table. However, this question, I think, is of primary importance and of interest to me because it boils down, when you think about it, to the trade-off between economics and geopolitics. Basically, economics would recommend, high specialization, whereas geopolitics want to avoid reliance at all costs. And I think we've learned from the recent COVID crisis that what we had saw was economics solving issues of geopolitics, and economics driving the solution could not be sustainable in the long term. And so I think we need to reshift this conception that we have that free and smooth trade will only bring geopolitical alliances and stability in the trade, and that we need to ensure that geopolitics and alliances also, the other way around, drive free trade. And so in this trade-off that the countries are facing, who knows how they're going to assess the solution between avoiding reliance at all costs and economic specialization. I do think and I do hope that the answer that they find includes new actors on the long term, including developing countries, and that those supply chains, as we've discussed extensively, ensure that we create green growth through inclusivity, but not only through economics, but also through geopolitical alliances.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you. Gerardo, you have been working in e-commerce and digital government, as you just mentioned. That is a very important topic here in the organization. But we know when we talk about e-commerce and digitalization in general, and we normally have more participation and inclusion, but at the same time, it generates more challenges. And many people say that even exclusion when you are not part of that digital system. What do you think are the challenges we have on that regard, given that e-commerce is a big part of a very relevant part of the agenda right now in the WTO? What ideas from a young leader, and also a practitioner on that issue, you think that the WTO need to take into consideration in the idea of the new e-commerce and how it not transform and cannot be transformed in an exclusionary, dynamic?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. So you're right. I've been seeing these patterns and I will say positive factors and also the challenges as well in the application and adoption of technology. So I want to talk about first the good part. I think technology is and has proven, I have seen it with my own eyes, it has proven to be an enablement for to create inclusivity, efficiency, and also accessibility. I think in a very specific example is what we do. We operate e-commerce marketplaces for government. Our goal is not, is essentially to enable small businesses and people that didn't have access to these $3.7 trillion industry that is public procurement, small purchases. This industry is big, and if you're not a big player, you cannot participate. So our platform is enabling the small ones to effectively start selling to the biggest decision makers and largest buyers in the world, that is the government. So that is one specific example in the e-commerce area. I also know, and I have seen other platforms that, for example, there are artisans in some specific regions, like in Latin America, and also I know in Africa, that sell their products to their local markets. So in terms of global trade, e-commerce and technology is also helping these people. So they don't have only access to these limited pool of potential buyers that will potentially buy their products, but also they have a global, I would say, access to a wider audience. We know that there are some factors and challenges that exist, like what about the people that do not have access to internet, right? I think that's a big challenge. So on the other hand, I also believe that better access to, creating infrastructure for remote places and those places that don't have access to good internet, to have access to that, either via new 5G networks, Wi-Fi, but also other non-conventional ways like satellite networks, like for example the Starlink by SpaceX, that is providing internet to places that don't have access to internet in the past. So I think the challenge here, and like history has shown us, that if we continue doing things the way we did in the past, it's kind of very hard to obtain different results. So I think we need to get better at innovation. We need to think about new ways of doing things. Another positive example of the use of technology to lift people up is, for example, mobile banking. So many people in remote areas or poor neighborhoods do not have access or don't have quick access to banking services. So something as simple as, I heard about this company that is doing something amazing. They are essentially providing people with access to banking services, like access to credit, opening accounts via a simple SMS message. So it's not about bringing the technology to the highest level. It's about using what you have at hand, getting creative, challenging yourself, and creating new innovation, because that's the nature of innovation. But at the end of the day, I believe strongly that that is the power of technology. It gets better, it gets more efficient, it gets more affordable, and more accessible over time. It takes time, but I believe we need to start thinking in more creative ways about what can I do with what I have at hand. If I only have SMS messages in my country, in my community, let's start with that. Let's build new platforms and rethink how we do business. So I believe the usage of technology and e-commerce and other new technologies like AI and blockchain are transforming not only the private sector, but also the public sector. So public trade can happen in a smoother way. So people that are us, that are the decision makers and the ones that are on the day-to-day, can spend our time solving the big problems instead of focusing on solving problems that are repetitive or tasks that are repetitive and that can be automated with AI. So I think we should focus on the things, getting more creative, number one, about the solutions and how we solve problems, and creating processes to eventually put that in autopilot, and us focusing on the things that still need to be solved. So that's my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you, Gerardo. Now let's turn to the environmental agenda that you sort of introduced some ideas in the first part of the panel. And we have two social leaders, I would say, as it is Simon and Stephanie, working on environmental issues. Indeed, Stephanie worked a lot with circular economy, and Simon also working in environmental justice and climate justice. So how can the multilateral trading system, given that we are now facing a sort of a triple environmental crisis, climate change, pollution, and loss of biodiversity, how can the multilateral trading system be used to promote positive environmental outcomes and ensure that just transition that we are looking for? But even more, do you think that the WTO is the place to discuss about environment? Or maybe, sometimes, as some people say, could be an excuse, this agenda that is very important for the planet, but to not have progress in other part of the agenda. because we are still having unresolved issues, new part of the agenda as we just talked, and environmental issues appear, as a very all issue because it's a main topic right now because to save the planet. But is this the right place to work about this? And also how we can use positively, the system for having a positive outcome on that agenda. Stephanie.
That's a very good question. That's a very detailed and good question. The establishment of the WTO, and again, I'm not an expert like the huge experts here, but the establishment of the WTO was to regulate and then create liberalization of trade that benefits everybody. That's why when 23 countries joined in the beginning, they tried and solicited for a lot more to join. What we need to consider with environmental issues is, first and foremost, they are foundational. Where are we going to live? Where are we going to be? Where are we going to work? Where are we going to trade? Everything changes because if the foundation is not right, we can't build on anything. So there's the reason why environmental issues are crucial and foundational, and everybody is talking first and foremost about it, is because it affects everything, everyone, and puts people into dire situations. When there are extreme weather conditions and floods in certain places, resources are lost, especially, I speak a lot about the Global South because I'm from there. When all of these things happen, resources that has taken years to develop, infrastructure, all that, it goes to zero. So we go back to it. And so it affects trade, it affects our harbors, the sea levels affect our harbors, they affect everything we do, the sea defenses, everything we do. Before anything, and we are huge importers. That's the fact of the matter. It's not something we're proud of, but we are huge importers. We import everything, barely create anything. Everything comes from the West, comes from Asia. Yes, we're working on that. Yes, after the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and all of that has created our own regional bloc for trade and trade-related agreement. But to not consider implementing and integrating trade-related things and environmental-related things, it would be a big mistake on all of our sides. Because one, again, back to the issue of interoperability, and this is a very popular, growing word, but it's going to be common. What this simply means is this, that all frameworks, regulations should come together and work together from all the different trade blocs, from the Asian trade bloc, from the North American one, from the NAFTA in the US and the likes, all of those trade blocs in the EU should come together and work together so that all the policies that affect everybody cumulatively would consider various environmental issues. The WTO is an important place to host this because the frameworks are developed on this level. Coordinated frameworks can be developed, correlated frameworks can be developed that would consider all the various parties. Because in this room are diverse countries. When they're making a decision, when they're taking a decision, it's everybody's opinion. But when the various economic blocs do things, it's their interests, their priorities. That is why this is an important platform to host this event and talk about this. And as a young person, again, you've heard the story, you've heard the blah, 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 you've heard all those, you've heard the activist, and I am one. I have been one and I will be one for a long time, even though you develop expertise over time. But the thing is, when frameworks are developed here, capacity is built for people that don't have a lot of negotiation power when it comes to bilateral agreements. The frameworks that are developed by the WTO here can curtail something we call greenwashing, where you see organizations and corporations that seek their interest and paste labels that we don't know. And a discussion with Bonnie this morning even reminded me that the UK has put some regulations in place for those who are certifying others to be regulated, because we don't even know whether the certifications they are offering lately are as legitimate. Who knows whether somebody had gone to invest in somebody's business and they decided to certify them? These are the concepts that we are talking about, and the only people that can stand are the huge organizations, the development organizations, the International Trade Organization, the UN, the ITC, especially as well, because they deal with SMEs and small businesses and all of that. They help in the regulation from the beginning. So they can come together and develop standard certifications and related matters for businesses who have been responsible, first and foremost, for the climate crisis for the last 200 years of pollution and all of that. They can develop standards for carbon and carbon trading, carbon crediting, so that it's not just regional blocks with regional interests, but it would be a global, well-development matter that would consider all the various aspects, the various actors, and the people that are more vulnerable to the economic circumstances because they don't have a huge negotiating power. They can also enable certain trainings and facilitations. I don't say these things without frameworks, without talking about capacity. Because people need to build capacity. Most of the time it is built here, and then we get the remaining there. When they have an interest, then they come there. And I say these things because it needs to be heard. Right? So when there's an interest, then they send some resources or some capacity. But neutral organizations like this can set a different standard for everybody. That's another part of it that is really important. The last issue I would like to really mention on this particular topic is simply this, that small and growing businesses, I know that the WTO and then the UN came up with the ITC that works a lot with the SMEs. So small and growing businesses that works with local levels, that works with things that organizations that are starting. Migros, apparently 100 years ago, 100 plus years ago, was a 5-business truck company. And they are where they are. They're a big, huge company today. So the small businesses, the small business organizations that also work in trade, because trade affects them. The backbone of a lot of economies is SMEs, right? Trade is not just the big multilateral trade. Trade is everybody. It's inclusive of everybody. So the frameworks consider these ones as well. And they integrate environmental issues from the start, not an afterthought. We've had a lot of those already. We are dealing with the effect, trying to convince people that the policy needs to get this, the policy needs to get that. But integrate it from the framework so that it's a part of it. Because first and foremost, we work with the earth, we live on the earth, and it's how we operate. Then issues around IP, intellectual property. That's one of the parts where the WTO actually also look at, the GATT also looks at. There's IP issues in environmental related matters. Because sometimes we get a lot of decisions come from the top bottom, and that we need bottom down up approach. But those ideas that belong to people, somebody will take very good ideas from local levels on environmental related issues in trade, and then we see the idea in some proposal or on some development organization in Europe, and you wonder, how did it get there? But they are not recognized. What are these IP issues that we are looking at on trade levels? Very important issue. And I had a discussion with a colleague on farmers, cocoa farmers, and because this is Geneva, I'm going to talk about cocoa and chocolate. We make the best chocolates in the world, by the way. So, because there are issues on farm, we deal with farmers. The chocolate that ends up on your plate, in your supermarkets are coming from our lands. That's a big trade issue. Now, the people that developed them, the ideas that went into those things, how are we protecting the farmer and their ideas? Is it beneficial to them? We're discussing research, IP, and environmental related matters in agriculture. How those synergies, do we have enough data to back them, to make decisions, to even recognize them in the first place? Do we have to think about them in a different scope that we currently are? Because at the end of the day, trade needs to work for everybody, and it needs to be very inclusive. And if you don't remember anything I said, because I've said a lot, there are existing conflicting things. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to have everybody thinking about it. We need to have frameworks on this level that penetrates to the grassroots. The top-down approach is good, bottom-up is better as well. How do we do all that to have a very inclusive framework that regulates all the certification standards and greenwashing that's going around?
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you so much. You have raised so many interesting points. And Simon, and I will go back to you and Connie about inclusivity in a few minutes. But what do you think about this idea of use the system, positively to promote positive environmental outcomes?
Yes, I mean, first, I think it's important to state the facts. In the last 50 years, populations of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians have decreased by 69%. So let's be clear, life on Earth is collapsing. More than half of all CO2 emissions emitted since the Industrial Revolution, so 1751, took place in the last 30 years. So despite significant investment in renewable energies, we've never burned as much fossil fuel as last year. Another crazy fact, every year we produce 100 billion items of clothing, even though on this planet right now, we have enough clothes for the next 6 generations. So I think this couldn't be clearer. The system in which we currently live is not sustainable. And this system is also a system that you participated in creating. This system is not sustainable, and this system is incompatible with planetary boundaries. So to address that, I think that's also something I mentioned quickly in the introduction. I think we need to challenge the underlying beliefs behind the current, let's say, institutions, and behind the institutions that we created, meaning also the WTO. I'm talking about one in particular, which is our common obsession, or actually your common obsession, for economic growth. So GDP is a completely outdated measure. It doesn't include well-being, it doesn't include inequalities, it doesn't include planetary boundaries. Because of that, basically any type of economic growth is currently being pushed and valued. So let's be clear. Global trade is at the moment supporting companies like Shine that produce fast fashion, or like Nestlé, a Swiss company that is literally stealing water from springs to put them in plastic bottles and sell them across the world. So every year we keep extracting more and more raw materials from the earth to produce even more goods. I brought with me a little graph. Maybe you can see it on the screen. This graph shows the growth of GDP, and it compares the growth of CO2 emissions, so we can see that there is a slight decoupling happening between CO2 emissions and GDP growth, which is good news, but I will come back to that later. But the other line is what we call MF, so material footprint, is all the raw materials that we are currently extracting from the world. So what this graph shows is that all the while the more we push economic growth, the more we are extracting raw materials from Earth. And there is a very, let's say, bad news on that, is that there has been a team of 16 researchers who studied the decoupling between those two metrics and GDP. And the conclusion is the following. We conclude that large, rapid, absolute reductions of resource use and greenhouse gas emissions cannot be achieved through observed decoupling rates. So what does it mean? It means that we cannot stay within planetary boundaries against a background of continued economic growth. Basically, if we look at this graph, it means that the orange curve needs to go down. But there is also good news, and that comes from the UN. A special rapporteur from Human Rights and Extreme Poverty released a report this summer that says, quote unquote, an increase in GDP is not a precondition for the realization of human rights or for combating poverty and inequalities. So we can actually drop that metric and think otherwise, and we can still solve some of the biggest issues in this planet. So now in very concrete terms, I think trade policies should encourage countries in the global north to degrow their economies and to prepare their society for a post-growth economy, which means urgently reducing production of unnecessary goods. For less developed countries, we should be focusing on growing the production of goods and services that serve the well-being of people, exactly what Stephanie is working on. And you, as WTO, you could send a strong message by saying that you are dropping GDP as a measure. That will be, for me, I think, an exciting thing to announce. I think it's the last day of the forum, at the end of this forum, that the WTO is officially dropping GDP.
Interesting. Thank you, Simon. Thank you. Thank you for your answer. Let's switch now to inclusivity that you talk in your introduction, Bonnie. I know that you are working hard in gender equality. And also, you know, it's an important topic here in the organization. So sort of the same question we have for environmental issues. How do you think, you know, the organization can work on that regard? Given that we talk a lot about, you know, having a sustainable and equitable organization, but sometimes it's so difficult to see, okay, how we can manage with the diversity agenda we have here in the organization and put focus in inequality and related with inclusive policy. So what's your take on that?
Well, it's very hard to follow Simon after that. It's very hard to follow Simon after the dropping GDP call. So I do agree with that because, as I said earlier, I think we can't achieve environmental justice or inclusion for the multilateral trading system if we only have one goal in mind, which currently is maximizing economic growth through GDP. So I would, back your call. I don't have your same level of courage as bold as you, but I think that will be a great starting point, even just broadening what we define as success in the very first place. I think 5 years ago at the same WTO Public Forum, there was already quite a lot of strong focus on gender inclusion. So at that time, I actually wrote a Forbes article talking about, as I mentioned earlier, that women-owned businesses, on average, only 20% of exporting private companies are owned by women. That was a survey done 5 years ago by the ITC. And on the contrary, 36% of companies that do not export are owned by women. So, that definitely there is a case for gender inclusion. And I think WTO has already done quite a fair bit on centering gender inclusion in trade. But I think there needs to be really a wholesale rethink around the WTO's rules and reasons for being to really address the core issues around inclusion. So I think the anti-globalization wave and the rise of populist politics, especially in the West, are really because people don't feel included in the current global system. It's a sentiment that I'm trying hard to understand because I'm obviously a beneficiary of the globalized trade system. So I think there just needs to be, it might be requiring the DG to spend more time with disenfranchised communities, including in the global north, because I think without, for global north countries, which largely are democracies, you see that governments are responding to the demands of their voters, and the demands are currently pushing towards more GDP growth, pushing towards more jobs going back to their countries, pushing towards more protectionism. So without fully understanding that, last month in the UK, we've seen some racial riots where there was targeting of refugees and asylum seekers. So I think we really need to focus on understanding how we shift those perspectives so that there's more buy-in from voters in the global north towards this vision that I think both Stephanie and Simon so beautifully talked about. And I think we can't just add more rules to WTO because it's already very complicated. Even as a master, having a master degree, I still find it extremely complicated when I, participated in the model WTO. I think it wasn't the most exciting thing compared to maybe model UN conferences. So how do you make these rules and policies of the WTO relatable to normal people? And I think there's a lot of things that, using creative means like arts, culture, can you use more videos, photographs to really illustrate the power of world trade and to get more people into conversations. So I guess a challenge for me is how can I explain to my grandmother who's illiterate and who spent 20 years working as a garment worker, how can I have a conversation with people like her on what is the future of world trade that could really be benefiting all segments of society?
Thank you so much, Moni. Thank you. Let's open the floor to the audience, and we have a few more minutes to include new questions. We did a lot of effort, indeed, in the preparation we had today, And before the panel, we insist on have this interaction with you, given the characteristics of the panel that I assume many of you want to hear and have some question to the new generation. Maybe I want to start here, or I think the Director-General has something to say.
Yes, I have something to say, but I'd rather wait and
Okay.
give other people a chance
Great.
to comment, and then I'll come a little bit, towards the end.
Okay, so let's take some question from you guys, and it's open floor. And just say, sorry, your name. Okay, there.
Yes, thank you. My name is Emmanuel Wachendo. I am a policy analyst from the Institute of Economic Affairs Kenya, a think tank. So my question to the panel, very, very, very ambitious coming out of the gate. So when you consider, for example, that many countries in the developing world, their own state policies, their government policies are actually, take a particular case where you find that their policies are actually not trade-oriented, they're destroying their trade orientation, they're actually impoverishing their people. And so I want to know how far this panel thinks that those outside the government, like myself, NGOs all around the world, how far we should go in terms of placing intellectual pressure at the minimum on ourselves in terms of good economic policy, and then on the other hand also that these countries need to industrialize. So what do you think about the conflict between climate change conditionalities in the north and what the poorer countries must themselves do to enrich themselves to?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Maybe we can take one or two more questions, and then we come back to the panel. You.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Elisabeth Bürgi from University of Bern, Switzerland. A very nice panel. Should have been in the first or second day, I think, of this conference. I have a question to, what's your name? Simon. I fully agree with you. We have a problem of overconsumption in our countries, and that the degrowth debate is very important. At the same time, we have needs in other countries where you need GDP growth in order to improve livelihoods. So it's very difficult, I'm a researcher and academic, to think of new trade rules, how they should be framed very concretely in order to have a better balance in regard to all these goals we have to achieve. And my question to you would be whether you have some kind of very, very concrete ideas drafted down, etc., which could be inspiring for the debate.
Thank you. Thank you. Any more questions? There.
Hello, thank you so much for hosting this panel, and thank you so much for taking all these questions. My name is David Hollenstein. I am a student of political science at ETH in Zurich. And my question goes, I think, out to you, Simon, given your history as a consultant and your current role as an advocate for a more sustainable climate. My question is, like, whenever changes for a more sustainable approach to doing business is proposed to businesses, the first question, or like the first reaction you usually get, is some sort of, that's nice, but does it make money though? And so in a world where basically anything is second to profit, or where it seems like anything is second to profit, like, how will we get to a way of doing business that like grants our planet the attention that it deserves?
Thank you. Thank you for your question. I think now, Director, you have now any comments, and then of course I will ask you for a final remarks. But now, any question for the panel?
Yeah, no. Let me wait and let the panel,
Great.
Be able to respond, and then maybe I can come at the end with
Perfect.
some final remarks.
So let's.
Because I love it.
So let's start with the first question. I think it's a very interesting question of how far NGOs should go. So I don't know who feel comfortable. If not, I think Stephanie could have some takes on that, but please, guys, feel free to answer. But let's start with Stephanie about these ideas of how far NGOs should go, given that at the end are government dynamics that have some restrictions on that.
The issue draws back directly, and I work with an NGO, so I kind of understand what you mean. The issues, especially with regards to policy, domestic policy, and the choices that governments choose to make on the national level, and how far we should go in pushing that out, and how far we should go with regards to comparing development, industrialization, and climate change on the same scale. Which scale should top it up, which one should not? I would say this, that when it comes to issues of environment and climate change and development and industrialization, they do not have to live apart. We use resources. We found better ways. I have a bottle that is made out of sugarcane today. And I can tell you 5 years ago, it was not even on the table. We have not looked outside what was easy for us. That's where the problem came in. We were always considering how fast, how easy, let us move quickly. We have not looked outside those scopes. And for an NGO, advocating for policy on the national level is keen. Sometimes you have to do the most, you have to do too much sometimes and be target for governments and whatnot. But when it comes to that, you move beyond just what is comfortable to what gets everything done. It's truly what it is. And when it comes to NGO, the choice to choose whether you choose an economic development over climate sustainability related matters, again, it's not, that conversation should have been a no-brainer, because we can do both, because it's possible, because policies that work to integrate both, it's easy to find if we can just look beyond what we are used to. Because, oh, plastic is cheap, plastic is easy to use, plastic is common, plastic is what we've always known, so let's stick to plastic. That conversation, that discussion, if we looked a little outside, we realize we have other fibers, we have other things that could make up the framework, which large production over time and demand the supply, it will fall into line with economic principles that we already know, and will make profits that a lot of people are interested in. That seems to be the conversation starter. When you tell them it makes money, they are all like, oh yes, it's fine. When it makes money, you find a way to tell them it makes money. That is how they get on the table with you and even discuss these principles. So I hope that I have been able to touch on that question for you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bonnie, how about you? And because also you have an NGO perspective, maybe from another topics and issues, but it would be
Maybe I
interesting
can address the consulting question.
Okay.
So I think the third question was around kind of how do you shift businesses to kind of change what kind of to go beyond profits. So yeah, maybe a bit of contextualization. So I have a kind of consultancy that advises companies and foundations and investors on measuring social impact, social and environmental impact, and kind of improving their work on this aspect. And we work globally with 60 people. I think there's a really exciting development around impact accounting. So traditionally, we only account, financial statements of companies only state their profit and loss. But that doesn't factor into the rivers they've polluted, the people who've lost their arms, in industrial accidents, etc., or the villages that they have displaced, etc. So there's been a few decades of work on kind of moving financial accounting towards accounting for externalities, environmental and social externalities. So I think that is exciting, because if we can get to a stage where Nestle's and, let's say you mentioned them, their financial statements not only take into account the, billions of Swiss francs that they've actually generated, but that needs to be deducted by the harm they have caused to environment and to society. That is the opportunity for us to make sure that companies go beyond profits. But in the short term, I think we cannot rely on companies to be creating the change. I see the most efforts being done by philanthropic foundations and impact investors, asset owners who are in a position to look beyond profits, and whether that's the Gates Foundation, the Truden's Investment Fund Foundation, there are lots of foundations who are actually putting their philanthropic dollars in addressing some of these issues. So I think until we get to the point where impact accounting becomes mainstream, or that governments are not just talking to their voters on GDP growth, but actually their achievement on the Sustainable Development Goals, that's, the future we need to get to.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you so much. Any take on this, Gerardo, Lily? And then I will close with Simon. That I think there are two questions for you, Simon, so some closing remarks from you.
So I think, it's an interesting question. I think every organization, NGOs, governments, the civil society, everyone has a role. And I think the question was, how much can you push as an NGO? I think it's important for you to push, because at the end of the day, that is your role, to make sure that the experiences of your community and your country or region are being showcased and are being heard. So then the government and then also the international organizations can make decisions and can improve those systems based on data and based on direct feedback. So I think something interesting, like in my perspective of working with governments, many of the governments we work with in California, they have policies that they need to buy from different groups, minority-owned businesses, green products. So I think this is very important to, so they have those policies not because they want it only, but because the civil society is also pushing them. So I think it's important to keep that push.
Thank you, Gerardo. Lily?
So I think I both agree with you that everyone has a role to play, as well as with you, Bonnie, in the terms of that the main issue is kind of externality and how do you internalize them. And in that matter, I think governments have an incredibly important role to play in ensuring that those externalities are internalized by companies. I think individuals also have roles to play. I think Simon gave us a very good example of how when you think that your job is not going the right direction, maybe it is time for you as an individual to change. And we have seen that a lot in younger generations, and maybe less in other generations who are more established. And I wish I would see that more. I think the second kind of main impact is finance, of course. And we need more green finance, we need more finance towards sustainable transition, and we also need financial markets to fully account for the climate transition and the climate disaster risks. So at all levels, governments, international institutions, and individual, we can kind of create and change the rules of the game to ensure that companies do take into account climate risk and climate impacts.
Thank you, Lily. Some final comments on that, Simon, and then I will turn to the DG to conclude the panel. This fascinating panel, by the way. Simon.
Yeah, I will try to be quick. First on the question on consulting, I think I have maybe a bit of a more, let's say, radical view than you. I think it's very, very difficult to make large for-profit companies, especially owned by shareholders, to actually move and change in the way we need. But there are good news. There are other forms of businesses, cooperatives that are owned by employees, by consumers, that those companies have been shown to be more resilient, more willing to adapt to new realities, to a post-growth reality. So we should not only focus on this type of businesses. On the other question about very concrete trade policies, as mentioned in my introduction, I am not a trade expert, but I would say first that there is a grant on research about degrowth that has been won by the University of Lausanne and the University of Barcelona by Julia Steinberger and Jason Ickel, Giorgio Callis as well. And they are working on very, very concrete policies for degrowth, and that's at all levels. If we take 1 second to speak about the trade level, I think it starts by indeed recognizing that in the global north we need to degrow, but it's not true for all countries and all regions. As mentioned, we also need green growth elsewhere. And we also need to redistribute wealth better to make a diagnostic of the situation. And there has been a study that showed that actually there has been money, there is basically more money being taken out of the global south than being taken in. So in a couple of decades, there has been 16 trillion that were basically stolen by the global north from the global south. Sorry, from the global north, so that was coming from the global south. And so we need to address this issue, and that can start, for example, by canceling debt, by, for example, rethinking, our trade policies, and also stopping all tax havens, because if there is no tax havens, then there is no capital flight that is possible. And Switzerland on that is particularly guilty, as we were a tax haven until 2018.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. So we are right on time to conclude this panel. And before that, I would like to give the floor to the Director-General. And giving you the floor, I would like to say thank you, Director, for giving us the voice. I think having this panel as the final remarks and the final message of the public forum talks a lot about this organization at this moment. So thank you for that. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. What an exciting panel. And, we thought we would have it towards the end when we've listened, and then we'll have the voice of youth to challenge some of the things that are being said. And you've absolutely challenged us today. I want to thank you, Nicholas, for being a wonderful moderator, and each and every one of you had really important things to say. So that's the whole idea. The whole idea is to point out areas where you think we could think differently, do things differently. And what was interesting to me is also listening to how you as individuals are trying to do things differently, because it starts from each one of us. So I do welcome, but I do want to comment on 2 or 3 things, because I think this is a bit what bedevils the WTO from its past, that people have forgotten or are not aware of what the WTO was really set up to do or founded to do. Somehow, the protests that followed this organization all through its history made it out to be something which it should not have been. And I often joke to people that when I took this job, one of my sons, I had 4 children, said, "Why are you doing this? This is crazy and terrible for you to go and run this WTO that is destroying everything." And I had to have a serious family conversation about this, because I'd looked at, known the WTO throughout. So we do need to do a lot more to explain about the WTO and do outreach to younger generations, but also try to improve those areas where they think the organization is not doing the right thing. But I want to start with the very premise that the purpose for which the WTO was founded. And it's written into the documents of the founding, called the Marrakesh Agreement, into the preamble. And it says the purpose of this organization is to enhance living standards, to help create employment, and to support sustainable development. And I don't think any young people even know that, even older people. So it's not only about GDP and growth. This was in 1995, and it foresaw that sustainability of our planet should be a fundamental goal of this organization and trade rules. And it's there. I'm not inventing it. Please go look for this Marrakesh document and you will read it for yourself. That was what attracted me to compete for this job. Because I said, this is an organization whose purpose is so attractive. It's not just about making people live with higher incomes. It also talks about creating jobs. We all have to be gainfully employed, whether you're doing social impact, you're working for whatever. And then we have to have a livable planet, which I totally believe in. And climate change is an existential threat. And anyone who doesn't believe that is wasting their time. I'm sorry. So with that foundation, Many young people need to know this. And the issue is, how are we actualizing that? What are we doing within our trade rules and the way we do business? How are members working towards this? And members have been doing quite a lot of good things. I'll just take one recent example of sustainability. So our fisheries and our oceans are being depleted. And one of the things that the organization was supposed to do is negotiate an agreement for the sustainability of our oceans. It's even SDG 14.6 that this organization was supposed to help the world deliver. But it took time and time and time, 22 years, no progress. But I want to compliment members of this organization because 2.5 years ago at MC12, is it up to 2 years ago, we were able, members were able to come to an agreement to negotiate the first part of this agreement, to do away with harmful subsidies, $22 billion worth, that are encouraging overfishing, or have these subsidies repurposed into doing good to sustain our planet. So this is what sustainability is about. That's just an example. But many people are not aware. So I want to reassure you that we are doing those things. Second, on climate change, we decided that there's a membership committee here called the Trade and Environment and Development Committee that takes time to discuss all the issues related to climate change and to plastics pollution and to, fossil fuel use and all of these things that are worrisome with respect to the way we consume. Members are discussing this. And from the Secretariat, we decided to look and say, people see trade as detrimental to environment. What can we do to make it work to help us get to net zero at 2050? And we developed this handbook. It says Trade Policy Tools for Climate Action, okay, for COP29. And if you go through, public procurement is one tool. You are working on in this organization, there's a public procurement agreement, okay? Public procurement is $13 trillion. As a purchasing power, you've seen it already. It can help drive green. This is one of the things we recommend in this toolbox. And on and on. I don't want to take too much time. So I'm just saying the criticisms you make are valid, but we are really working towards these things very carefully, and there's evidence for you to see what we're doing. Now, on inclusion, we decided that we needed to do more for those who are left out to be included. Our World Trade Report this year, which we launched, Trade and Inclusiveness. So we're asking the question, how did trade do in terms of helping lift people out of poverty? What did it not do? More important question. And what can it do better to include? So here's the report. So we care deeply and intensely about what trade does and the way it does it. So I just wanted to respond to those things because I do not think on GDP. So this is to answer your question that in this organization, GDP is not seen as the only measure. It's not only about enhancing living standards. It's also about creating employment and making people gainfully employed in whatever way. And it's also about sustainable planet and living within our planetary boundaries, many of which we have already exceeded. Now, when we think about degrowth, maybe it's deconsumption, okay? Maybe we need to reimagine the way we consume in this planet and how much we consume. You find that a whole country in the global south, the electricity consumption of that country is not even up to that of New York City. I can quote you many countries whose electricity consumption is below that of New York City, or in many cities. So somebody raised it. So do you now tell these people, no, please, stay in the dark, okay? Don't have light. Don't have jobs. Don't eat well. That's what GDP is about. GDP is not about money. It's about whether you have light, you have a job, you can eat, and all that. So you cannot say that. I think we need to reimagine the way we grow our economies. And the developed countries need to reimagine it even more and talk about how they consume, okay? And we need to think beyond the bottom line. I agree with that, about beyond money, to other instances. And you know that Bhutan has developed an indicator that it's not about just GDP. So I agree with you on that. You know, but we need to be very careful how we spell it out. Otherwise, you might have people who are saying to others that, let's not. You know, it's like climate. Those who didn't cause the carbon emissions, you know, are asking, why must we pay a very big price? We need help from those who caused the problem to help us. We must contribute, but help us to adjust. I think it's the same thing. How does the world work together so that everyone is working to the same objective, but some are helping others to get to the same objective? So I think these are some of the thoughts I wanted to add. And finally, on the issue of corporations, some corporations were actually beginning to look at this issue. Danone in France had developed metrics where you had double or triple bottom lines, as they call them, not only looking at profit, but also looking at impact. But then shareholders didn't want it. Shareholders wanted something else, and the CEO who started this was booted out. So if the young generation wants double and triple bottom line, beyond living it yourself, you also have to agitate to get it. I believe in it. We can't only be looking at one bottom line. So those are my comments. Very exciting. I love what you had to say, and I thank you. We have a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Director. I think it was a this was a fascinating panel, I think, and we have a great conversation. We have talked about legitimacy, transparency, inclusivity, and the necessity of more participation. But at the end of the day, here you have, I think, a generation that's still having hope on the system. So this is, I think, an important remark. Here there is a generation that's still having hope on the system, and not only thinking about the future, but also creating the future. So let's conclude this with a round of applause for this great panel we just have.